India is embarking on a human spaceflight program. Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced from the ramparts of the Red Fort on Independence Day that an Indian boy or girl will go into space by the 75th year of India's independence, which is year 2022. I have with me a veteran NASA astronaut, Michael Barrat. He spent in one go 199 days in space and has had two sojourns to space. And he is a medical doctor, a very special and a rare breed. Michael, what is your first reaction when you heard that there is now a fourth country which is wanting to embark on a human spaceflight program?
Well, I would have to say that for us in the astronaut office and the astronaut community, we all feel that the more spaceflight, the better. The more people who engage in this, the better for everybody. So we're actually quite excited and certainly very supportive of India's program.
Do you think in the long run, would it reduce cost for access to space because India is known for its low-cost access to space?
Well, it's definitely possible. You know, every country who starts looking at spaceflight applies their technical know-how and does things a little bit differently. And they start from a point where there's already a lot of technology developed and they can enfold the newest and the best technology into their plan from the start. That typically cuts costs, and that's something that India is quite adept at. And so, sure, I think that's a definite possibility. And again, that would be a pipeline and enabling of more spaceflight, which, again, we think the more the better.
And do you think in the long run, should the four countries which have capabilities, right now three, which is Russia, America, and China, and if India adds on four countries, should it do more collaboratively in the long run? Maybe if there is colonization to be done, should it be collaborative or should it be independent, each country trying to access and setting up colonies or setting up habitations outside Earth?
Well, it's a good question. I personally believe that a combination of those two is important. Every country that pursues human spaceflight should develop an independent capability, and that is, again, makes us stronger because it brings independent capabilities to an international table that can provide redundancy and support one another. However, with that independent capability, I think collaboration is the obvious next step. That's certainly how we run the International Space Station, which is a model that includes two former Cold War adversaries, the US and Russia, along with 15 member states from the European Space Agency, Canada, Japan. It's not an easy way to work, but it's a very effective way in the end, and we all know where the strengths and weaknesses are. Everybody brings their independent technologies and know-how to the table, and we're stronger for that. And so with India's demonstrated capability of flying humans, which we hope to see soon, we would expect contribution to an international collaboration.
Because right now India doesn't go to the International Space Station because it's not a signatory to the space station. It lost out on that, but India wants to be a party to any agreement which happens post ISS. Do you think the world would welcome that?
I wish I could predict the future with 100% certainty, but I would like to hope so. Again, when nations demonstrate that capability, it's more than showing that they can build rockets. It's demonstrating a resolve. It's demonstrating a commitment to spaceflight and developing this technology to make their nation and the rest of the world better. I personally believe that the world works better when it works together. And working in a field of space flight is an area which politically is fairly untouched and pure, if you will. And so I personally would absolutely welcome India to that table.
Let's come to a little bit about how astronauts are selected, what are the qualities of an astronaut. You're a medical specialist. As far as I know, the Indian Space Research Organization, they make great rockets, they make great satellites, they are great, lovely engineers, some of them are good scientists, but the human systems is where they are weak. Can you tell me a little bit about when you look for astronauts as part of the selection process, what are the criteria you're looking for in boys and girls or men and women who could become good astronauts?
Well, that's a great question. And it really depends on the mission being flown. Right now, the mission is the International Space Station, and the typical tour of duty is 6 months. And during that 6 months, you are basically staffing a laboratory, a very busy, very productive laboratory with high expectations. And so the people you choose must be people who can live in a somewhat isolated environment for months at a time with a very small group of individuals and be expected to work hard every day. The conditions are fairly well known, unlike an exploration voyage to the moon or to Mars, but the expectations are very high for work. So what we're looking for are pretty much well-rounded individuals. We are not actually looking for geniuses. We want people who have a demonstrated capability in something useful to us, engineering, for instance, medicine, virology, even veterinary medicine. I'm thinking of the people we actually have in the astronaut office right now, but who have also showed that they can function in isolated places, out of their comfort zone, if you will, and can work either in a field environment or a laboratory environment that's remote and uncomfortable. And we actually had over 18,000 applicants for our last round of selection. We were able to choose 12 of those. So
how did you get these 18,000? Did you give out an advertisement, or how did people come to know that they can opt to become an astronaut?
So this was the first time we actually used social media to advertise the fact that we needed a new class of astronauts. And the response was maybe as expected. We had a huge number, much greater, more than 3 times what we'd had in the past. And with that, we had to go through every application, and we did. We were able to winnow that down to about 12,000 plus that were truly qualified.
12,000 plus were qualified. Wow.
12,000 met our minimum standards, and then we formed teams of astronauts. The astronauts have a huge role in choosing the next astronauts. And every application was read thoroughly, at least by 2 individuals. And if you were on my team, 3 individuals, because I led the team that reviewed all the biomedical applications. That was about 2,400. And from those, we had to select a little over 100 to invite down for interviews and examinations at the Johnson Space Center. And of those that passed that level, that step, we brought down another 50 from that group, and then we chose 12 from that group. And by that time, you realize that maybe 200 of those people are absolutely capable of doing this job. And then it gets down to the nuances. You meet these people, you spend time with them, and you think, could I lock myself in a large room with them for 6 months and get along well? And so by that time, it becomes a combination of intuition and skill set.
So is it more to do with the psychological conditioning of a person, or is it more to do the physiological condition or the health fitness issue? What plays a role, or all of it?
Certainly all of those play a role. We need people of reasonable health and fitness, and some people think we choose elite fitness, and we do not. We're not looking for elite athletes so much as health, long-term health. When we choose someone, we commit, and we want them for a 10 to 20-year astronaut career. Why? Because it's very expensive to train an astronaut. It's very labor-intensive to select and train and maintain proficiency training. So it hurts us to choose somebody who has a risk of maybe a medical risk of not being able to continue. So we choose health over fitness, but fitness has to be relatively good as well.
And how much does it cost to train an astronaut? Over time, is there a number which is available?
There probably is. I'm not aware of that number. But because of what we do for training, which includes high-performance aviation, jet aircraft flying, extensive diving and working in a large pool where we do spacewalk training and adventure training, if we will. We spend time in underwater habitats and out in the field doing hiking in very cold weather, for instance. But all of these are very expensive training venues, and we do these continually throughout an astronaut's career.
So would it be several $1 million per astronaut?
Definitely. Absolutely.
So
Certainly over time, several million dollars.
So it's not an cheap training. So it's an intensive and expensive training. So people who join have to be really committed to it.
That's absolutely right. The people who join must be committed, and the community of people who select these individuals must be equally committed. in supporting these folks. When you think about it, though, once an astronaut is in space, he is, by definition, the most expensive worker in human history, in the human condition. It took so much to get him there, a big infrastructure, a rocket to get him there, rocket supplies. They say that for every astronaut who spends 6 months on the space station, you need one equivalent of a Russian Progress cargo vehicle to sustain them.
Wow.
So, essentially, you get your own rocket full of supplies. So that is extremely expensive, and you want to ensure the optimal performance of that individual when you get there. So the training is extremely cost-effective, but it is expensive.
And what is roughly the median age of astronauts, and who's the youngest and who's the oldest who's ever flown?
Well, that's a good question. So that has changed over the years, and certainly when we were flying frequent space shuttle missions, the average age was probably in the low to mid 30s for flyers. Now these are missions that were maybe 5 days to 2 weeks in length, and we were flying several of them a year, between 4 and 6. Now on space station, the demographic has changed quite a bit. So the average age of a space station flyer is like 47 or 48 or so.
That's old.
Well, we don't think of it that way, but that's mature. And these are the people that seem to do very well during these long-duration missions. And recently, we've actually had a little bit of a trend towards selecting some younger people. And so I think the youngest person in this recent class we took was 28 or so. I will tell you that I was 40 years old when I was first selected as an astronaut, and I turned 50 during my first flight.
That is a lovely time to convert to 50 in space.
That was a great birthday. Couldn't have spent it better anywhere else.
Your family must have missed you.
Sure. Frankly, the experience of spaceflight is amazing. It's exhilarating. It's magical. It's very demanding. But everybody absolutely loves it. But the thing you miss most is your family, and that's certainly a mutual thing.
Yeah, Sunita Williams says she misses her dog more than her husband.
Well, Sunita had a very unique dog at the time, Gorby, as we called him. But Sunita's a good friend of mine, certainly, and she actually helped to take care of my children the days before I launched, actually, and shortly after. So,
She is a rock star in India. Whenever she turns up, she attracts crowds like anybody.
Yeah.
She is a role model for many, many Indian girls.
Well, that's good to hear because she's Auntie Sunny to my 5 children as well. So,
That's so nice to hear. So what was your first experience when you took your first flight into space? When you got into the rocket, were there butterflies in your stomach that, will it fly, will it not fly, what will happen?
of course, I was almost 50 when I took my first flight, and I had been training for a long time and had already been working for NASA for, 19 years or so. I had a very good understanding of spaceflight and the environment, and I would say more than anything, I was task-focused. I knew my duties, I knew exactly what was supposed to happen when, and I had basically responsibility to monitor systems of the rocket. And this is on the Soyuz launching out of Kazakhstan. And so for the most part, you're very task focused. In fact, I would say it's worse for families watching you than it is for you because you've got your job to do. But always at the back of your mind, you realize that you're sitting on tons of explosives and propellants. And if you're not a little bit anxious, then you don't really understand where you are, I would say.
And if India tasks you to choose an astronaut for the country, how would you go about? It's a hypothetical situation, and I'm putting it as a hypothetical situation for you. If you were given the consultancy to choose an astronaut, how would you go about?
Well, I would fall back on what we know that has worked for us, and we have a set of criteria and a set of character traits that we look for: resilience, perseverance, teamwork, individual care, self-care, team care, and technical know-how, commitment to learn, long-term commitment to learn, things like that we have instruments to survey, either personality surveys, interviews with psychologists, psychiatrists, and direct interaction with current flying astronauts. It's not that difficult for us to pick out character-wise who will be good. It's a little more difficult to write that down in a concrete way that everybody understands, but it is something that I think we're pretty good at now. And then you will get down, like we did, to a few hundred potentially people who could do the job just fine. at that point, you're going to need to decide who do you want to be the face of India in space.
The face of India is what is the key thing today.
Right, and that should not be sold short at all. That's extremely important because at that point, these people will become inspirational and ambassadors and leaders for your country.
And how would you think? See, because India, as I said, ISRO doesn't have too many capabilities in human life support systems. What should it do to develop its capabilities? The Indian Air Force has the Institute of Aerospace Medicine. Yes, they have a centrifuge there, but they do mostly pilot training.
Right.
So do you think test pilots would be a good bet, or test pilots, Air Force test pilots are not a good astronaut?
Well, okay, so let me back up a little bit. When you look at history of astronaut selection and formulation of an astronaut cadre, most countries, US, Russia, certainly Europe as well, have started with their aviation medical institutes because that was the closest overlap to the environment that spaceflight really is. And it has made sense and it has worked. And it's not unreasonable to do the same if you have an aerospace medicine or an aviation medicine institute. So that would be a good place to start. The other big thing is to reach out to countries that already have experience in this and collect as much information as you can from each of them. What works for India most likely will be, in fact, a hybrid of several of these methods of what type of selection factors and training that you want to emphasize. So if you do start with an aviation medical institute, an aviation medical institute for selection, then you come to training, and again, you have to look at the mission that you're flying. Now, this is a new vehicle, so you have new astronauts and a new vehicle in this equation. And this is a place where test pilots really do shine because they are used to qualifying equipment in extreme conditions. And I would say a new spaceship flying into orbit is exactly that. However, I wouldn't limit it to that whatsoever because, certainly we've found, and it makes sense, that spacecraft are not aircraft. And the spaceflight environment is very different from that in which they have trained. So the principles of qualifying hardware are extremely useful, but there's very little overlap between, say, 2 or 3 hour sortie in a jet aircraft in high performance conditions and a multi-day or multi-week mission in spaceflight. They're just very different animals. And so we find that a diversity of crew skill sets really serves us well.
Because India wants to do, as the Indian Space Research Organization has suggested, it would probably be a 3-person crew.
Right.
And obviously it seems the commander would be a test pilot because flying skills come into play there.
Right.
And very, very high possibility that there would be at least one lady or a female, because the Prime Minister stood up and said clearly it would be a son or a daughter of India.
Right.
So it will be very hard for the Indian Space Research Organization not to include a woman.
Right.
Do you think in the first flight would it be too risky to take women, or would it be okay to take women who have qualified and trained?
Well, we have not found any increased risk with flying women at all. I mean, the U.S. astronaut cadre is about 30% women or so, or maybe even 35% nowadays. And we don't even think about that when we assign roles. We've had women commanders of space shuttles and women commanders of the space station, and they do absolutely fine. So male or female, it doesn't change the risk one way or the other of mission success. But really, you have to look at the requirements of the vehicle. And if it requires hands-on, I think those hands, being test pilot, especially for your first few missions, is not a bad idea. The question is how many sets of hands need to be moving controls or even to provide backup to controls. So you might need 1 or 2 test pilots for the first 1 or 2 missions. Now, that doesn't mean the test pilots can't be women. Yeah, we have certainly had women test pilots in our astronaut corps, and they do great. But again, knowing that spacecraft are not aircraft, we have found that eventually, once you've proven the hardware, it definitely doesn't need to be a test pilot. One of my very good friends, Sergei Ryazonsky, he's a medical doctor and a biologist from the Institute of Biomedical Problems in Moscow. and he was a commander and pilot of the Soyuz vehicle. So was Oleg Kotov, who's also a flight surgeon, and others who have been engineers, aerospace engineers, or other technical people in Russia that have flown very successfully as commanders and pilots.
So gender won't make a difference.
Gender doesn't make a difference. No, it's really about training and experience and commitment. So.
Because in the Indian Space Research Organization, men and women work shoulder to shoulder, as seen, and they do very well. So if that is carried forward, I think it should probably be able to do it. Now, you're a biomedical specialist. When you go into space, what kind of changes do you see in the body? We can spend a little time talking about this because very few people have the kind of experience like you have.
Yeah, well, certainly every system in the body changes and at different rates. And there's actually a well-developed knowledge base out there, published data and textbooks and whatnot. But just to summarize it, when you step on board that rocket, you are committed to about an 8.5 or 9 minute ride, an acceleration profile into space where you will weigh between 3 and 4.5 times your body weight for a short time. And then typically the engine's cut off very abruptly. So the transition to zero gravity is not gradual at all. All of a sudden you are weightless. And that is accompanied by an immediate shift of fluids from your lower body up to your chest and head. And within a few seconds, you feel like you're hanging upside down. And along with those shifts to the head, you actually feel stuffy and headachy, and it's not very pleasant at first. There's also a version of seasickness, which hits about 50% and sometimes more of everybody who flies. And that can happen within the first minutes to hours of flight. And so your sense of balance is totally challenged up there. And so that can make you sick for a little while. Fortunately, that goes away in a couple of days. And along with this, your body starts undergoing other physiologic changes that you don't necessarily feel so much. Your body changes shape, which is quite interesting. You get a little bit taller, your waist gets a little bit thinner, and actually your organs move up in your chest a bit, which has been quite interesting for us to understand. And your heart changes in ways that are maybe a little bit technical, but the heart actually gets larger quickly as it's pumping all that blood that is now shifted from the lower body, and the heart's output increases quite a bit. And over a couple of days, the plasma volume that circulates decreases to compensate for this, and your red blood cells decrease to compensate. And as this happens, your body is actually getting better. It's optimizing itself for being weightless. And you learn to navigate in 3 dimensions, and you learn to tolerate the fluid shifts. And it's really quite remarkable to see what the human body does. And you become a space creature, an extraterrestrial that can live up there for months at a time and do well.
So the human body can also survive well in almost zero gravity.
Survive reasonably well. Now, there are some things that are negative. You do lose bone and muscle mass because mostly your bones and muscles are shaped by the loads on them, and most of those loads come from walking around just like we do on Earth every day. You take that away, and the bones and muscles involved with carrying your body around start to weaken. And so you have to exercise hard, 2.5 hours a day, actually, we exercise on station to keep our bones and muscles strong. If we don't do that, we'd be extremely weak and fragile when we come home. And there's other changes that we've found that involve the brain and the eye and the optic nerve, which are probably not so good, although we don't feel them, but it changes the architecture of those structures in a way that may not be good for us. But again, we don't feel it, and we tend to work right through it. But it shows you how the human can adapt to an extreme environment in ways that we just never predicted until we started flying in space.
This is an issue when you are wanting to come back to Earth. Yes. With weight.
Yes.
Suppose one were going on to colonize places and live for a long time or travel for a long time, then some of these issues, how would they change and how would they adapt and how would human body adapt?
Well, so that's a really good question. So we would rather not colonize weightlessness. So if we put a large population on the space station, we would want to induce some type of artificial gravity, either, well, most likely to spin it to get centrifugal force. Mostly we would like that weightlessness to be associated with a transit time, a travel time from here to Mars, for instance. And then landing on Mars, you are now in a reduced gravity field of about 1/3 of a G, as we call it, 1/3 gravity. But that's probably enough to stave off a lot of these negative problems. So I don't think you would see the brain and eye problem, and it would be very easy to exercise because you can load yourself in a linear fashion very easily. Just increase the weights on your exercise machine, and you'll do fine. So I think that the human body has already shown that it can perform pretty optimally in weightlessness. 1/3 of a gravity won't be a problem. It'll be different. And there will be some of these changes that we talked about, but I believe we could live there long term without a problem.
So, evolution towards zero gravity for humans is a real possibility?
Well, I think we've demonstrated that we don't have to evolve. The amazing thing is that we've demonstrated that even now we have adaptive powers, adaptive mechanisms that optimize us for weightlessness that we didn't know we had. So the question, two questions arises. How does this happen? Well, we're working that out scientifically, but the bigger question to me is, why does this happen? Why are we able to do this? The human body is just that amazing, to be honest.
And when you go into space, and there are many people who want to know, because India has had only one astronaut in space, which is Wing Commander Rakesh Sharma, who flew in 1984,
Right.
An amazing person. And we've had women of Indian origin, Sunita Williams and Kalpana Chawla, who flew on the space shuttle. But other than that, Indians see many NASA astronauts come in who speak, give inspirational talks. And I'm sure my viewers would want to know, how does your daily life go in the space station? How do you wake up? What time do you wake up? How do you sleep? How does the daily life go in a zero-G confined space environment?
So, good question. We're on Universal Time, Greenwich Mean Time, and that's the best split between the European and the Russian and the US and the Japanese space agencies. So we observe that time for our onboard schedule. And we are scheduled for, I think, 8 or 9 hours of sleep. Nobody sleeps that long up there. We get tired because we work hard. For me, I slept from midnight to 6 every day regularly, and so that worked for me very well. But you get up in the morning, you look at your schedule for the day, you understand the experiments that you're going to do or the maintenance that you're going to do. You gather the tools that you need for that. You collect questions that you need. You have breakfast. And then you talk to the ground every day for a conference in the morning, and you discuss the day's events and any questions you might have and any news from home. And then you start down the schedule. So for instance, maybe from 8 o'clock in the morning till 9:30, you're doing a three-dimensional perception experiment. And after that, you put all that away and you may be doing a combustion experiment or a fluid physics experiment. And then you have to stop and exercise for 2 hours. And then you may need to run to the window to take photographs of a ground target that's of interest to the observers on the ground. And so you do that all day until dinner time or so. My crew always gathered for dinner together, and we would eat. We had a great time, and then we'd go back to work in the evening, getting ready for the next day and trying to sort through pictures and catch up on anything we didn't quite finish. So every day is like that. Every day is busy, but it's different enough because the experiments change day to day. So it keeps you very interested.
So is your day on the space station almost minute by minute figured out before you leave, or is there some flexibility so that if you want, you can look out of the window and look for ET?
Well, there is a little bit of flexibility. If you are fast and you can finish a task early, then sure, you have some time. And by the way, if we do have spare time, that's exactly what we like to do. Look out the window, not so much for ET, but with cameras and taking pictures of the ground. And those have proven very valuable for everything from weather patterns to city planning and whatnot. But the days are very busy, make no mistake, and we really do get tired at the end of the day. So.
And people always are curious, how do you brush your teeth in zero gravity? What happens to the froth? Where does it go?
There's two populations of people on the station, those who swallow and those who spit. We use as little bit of toothpaste as we can, but literally you just wet it with a squirt bottle and brush away. You try very hard not to release any. You don't have a sink that you can spit into, obviously, because there's no gravity to pull the water anywhere. So some folks will spit that into a gauze pad and throw it away, and some people would swallow their toothpaste and wash it down with water. So.
And what about daily ablutions? How do you pass urine? What happens to stool? These are things which we don't even worry about on Earth. On in zero gravity situations, how do you do all that?
Well, I'll start that by saying there's a very steep learning curve when you first get up there. But we have zero gravity toilets, and instead of gravity to separate urine to make it flow into a bowl or whatever, we use airflow, forced airflow. So we have hoses with fans and suction, and you want to urinate right into that hose. So you turn on the fan first, always, and then start urinating, and off it goes. Now, so it's kind of interesting urinating to the hose. What's more interesting is where the urine goes after that. So we collect all of the urine, we distill it basically, and through a series of processes, we will reclaim that water and recycle about 85% of it into potable drinking water. So whatever you urinate into the hose, you will drink in your coffee next week. That's actually a very good thing for us, because recycling 85% of your water is huge.
Sounds yuck.
No, it's not bad at all. Knowing where your next drink is coming from is extremely important. And it costs a lot of money to launch a kilogram of anything. And so if you don't have to launch that extra water, it's good for everybody.
We had a prime minister, Mr. Morarji Desai, who used to do that, which is to have his own urine as a drink. Shivambu, he used to call it. But for astronauts, this is routine stuff?
Well, when you're finished with all these processes, it is pure water. And you actually have to add minerals to it to flavor it a little bit. So it's as good as any bottled water, or better than any bottled water you would buy. And it works beautifully. And in fact, my mission was the first one to actually use that recycled water.
And how do you sleep? Is there a flat bed, or is there you stand and sleep, or what is the procedure in which you sleep?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. Lying down or standing up have no meaning up there. With no gravity, up or down is where you choose to make it. Now, we do have sleep quarters, very small, about the size of a telephone box, actually.
That's large, huh?
Yeah, well, it's not too bad. Maybe smaller than a telephone box, but not bad. And we will have a sleeping bag in there, which is attached to the wall. And you just climb into that sleeping bag to keep you in one place, and let your arms float and let your legs kind of float, and you assume this zero gravity posture, and it's very comfortable. So, in fact, it's uncomfortable to be restrained flat. If you were to put a bed up there, nobody would be lying on it because they'd float away. But if you were to kind of strap them down, it hurts to be restrained out of that neutral body position. So everybody sleeps a little bit differently, but we sleep very well, by and large.
Do you dream in space?
Yeah, when I'm in space, I dream about being back on the ground with friends and family. And when I'm down here, I dream about being in space.
Pride of lying down, dreams are there.
Dreams are absolutely there. I mean, I think like on the ground, we use our dreams to help sort out the events of the day. And so I remember definitely dreaming about an experiment that went wrong and what I could have done better and things like that, or dreaming of home, so.
Also, people want to know, see, we are looking at long-term travel to, say, Mars. As of now, our propulsion system offers 9 months one way, and another 9 months if you have to bring them back safely. And if you're looking for setting up a permanent base there, how do men and women do what they do? Isn't zero gravity any sex possible, or is it permitted? What happens on the International Space Station?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's certainly possible. It's just not permitted. Now, remember, the average age is in the upper 40s. You know, we're a group of very well-mannered professionals with families, and when we fly, we're also very professional. And basically, it's forbidden because the spaceflight environment would be too harsh for a developing child, a developing fetus. Mostly that's because of radiation. And then the effects of weightlessness, we just have no idea what those would be like on a developing fetus. So everybody understands that the danger to a developing fetus is absolutely unacceptable. Now, if you establish a colony on Mars, that's a little bit different. I mean, we're taking our head and our hormones with us when we go to colonize, and then we will have to figure out some new things. But you have a gravity field, and you would have to have shielding from the radiation. But certainly procreation in an established colony in a gravity field shielded from radiation is possible.
Yes, because ultimately, if you have to go and colonize, you have to think of procreation. You cannot say you can't procreate, and you'll have to repopulate again and again through rockets. That's not an acceptable thing.
No. I mean, we expect that a self-propagating colony or self-sustaining colony is possible. The limiting point of that is resources. So.
And resources obviously will be the constraint, but human ingenuity sometimes outbeats everything, and we find solutions for every little problem. Who knew people would be traveling between New Delhi and New York twice a day,
Right.
100 years ago, till the aircrafts became common. So who knows what will happen in the future. What is your outlook towards the future of space travel? Is this something which the world should look at more as an exploration, or then look at more exploration than colonization? And how do you view that?
Well, I think there's a sequence that has been demonstrated over centuries when people have traveled over oceans, for instance, to new destinations. And that sequence is always exploration first. And you don't colonize a place that hasn't been explored in some fashion. And so exploration, finding out what's there, it's about discovery, and some of that discovery is science, some of that discovery is finding resources that are useful to us, places that are possible to live. And that would be followed by pioneers, people who understand that it's very austere, very undeveloped, but a place where it's possible to establish a beachhead and potentially start a life. And only after that do the colonists follow, people who come with a reasonable assurance of being able to scratch out a living and contribute to a self-sustaining population. And those will all be much more difficult, say, on Mars than they were in the Americas when the Europeans were first starting to come there. But again, we see that as very possible over the long run. Now, I can't predict what's going to happen in 100 years, but I can easily foresee the next steps, and those are the exploration steps to the moon and Mars, finding out what resources are really available to us.
They're already talking of a gateway on the moon for looking at areas beyond the moon, and moon as a gateway.
Right.
What is your view on that?
Well, so the Deep Space Gateway conceptually would be a station much smaller than the International Space Station, but something we could keep a crew on for long periods. And it would be in a special position, probably a cislunar orbit near the moon, not orbiting the moon, but a place where we could efficiently disembark for the lunar surface or for lunar orbit and move between those and the Earth very efficiently and potentially launch things off to Mars. And so having that type of a hub would make exploration of the lunar surface much more efficient. And that's what we're looking for. And we're finding, just like every place in the solar system, the moon is a lot more interesting than we thought. It most likely has water that would be very usable for us. And so learning to use the raw materials there is really key to establishing a base or a colony.
Yeah, the first discovery of the molecules of water came from the Indian Chandrayaan 1 mission, and which is a fascinating discovery. And subsequently, even this year, that there is water ice even on the surface of the moon on the South Pole has again come from looking at data of Chandrayaan 1. Did this discovery of water on the moon excite the astronaut community? Because we always thought it was a parched place.
Yeah. No, we've had some hints that there might be certainly water bound up in minerals, but water bound up in ice, cometary ice in craters. And that's been a little bit more indirect. These findings are a little bit more direct. So absolutely, it excites us quite a bit. Another discovery in the last couple of years was that of what appeared to be lava tubes, long caves, which give you immediate shelter from radiation and the harmful ultraviolet radiation from the sun. And so the idea that you might have a shelter that you wouldn't have to immediately dig or construct or excavate, and B, water to use for water for drinking, oxygen for breathing, rocket fuel. Absolutely, that makes the moon a much more interesting place than it was.
Let's come to a little bit of your personal life. You are in India. You've been interacting with the students at the IIT. Did you find these young boys and girls ready to embark on big journeys? What did you find from their interactions? Are they excited about doing science and technology?
Oh, certainly. The people who are here because they're very bright and because they're very intelligent and curious, and it's a very filtered population, and so it's been a pleasure to talk to them. Most of them are extremely curious and probably didn't know that much about spaceflight, and certainly the human aspect of it, because they're heavily oriented towards engineering. But as you talk to them, and the questions they ask, I think that really shows that insight. But I will tell you, Pavlo, the biggest impression on me is their commitment towards solving India's problems, looking for sources of clean water, applying technology to agriculture. That's been very impressive to me.
And in your personal life, you mentioned to me that you have two children who are from India. Tell us a little bit about that, and how did that happen, and how does it feel to come back to India?
Well, it's a good question. So I have 5 children, 2 by natural means, and one we adopted. She's from Nagpur, and another young gentleman, Prasad, from Hyderabad. And so, they come from India. They come from very different cultures and languages, and neither of them remember their languages, but they just kind of grew up in our family, and they're wonderful, and we just really loved having a lot of kids. The irony is we'd meant to come to India for many years and just haven't been able to, trying to juggle the 5 children and my wife's job and my job. But we all know that we're going to do that as a family at some point, and that's still to come. But it's been very special for me to be here finally for the first time and interact with the grown-up versions of my children. Now my children are grown up now as well, but it's been pretty special. By the way, we do eat a lot of Indian food at home. So
I noticed you love a lot of Indian food.
Yeah, well, it's provided. It's very nice here. So yeah.
If the Indian government were to invite you to witness the first launch of the Indian astronauts, would you be willing to drop by with your family?
Oh, I'd like that. Sure, that would be an incredible honor, actually. So
because you have an India connection and you've flown, you're a medical doctor. I'm sure if the government hears about it and you're willing and NASA permits, there should be a possibility.
Oh, I think it would be an amazing possibility. My family has seen launches, and we're kind of a space family. Although none of my children want to go into the space industry, but they certainly have a very strong connection between myself and all of their friends as well. And sure, I mean that would just be an amazing experience.
India wants to use some astronaut training facilities in other countries because the time frame they have for 40 months for launch is a little short. You've seen training facilities across the world. Give us a little flavor of what happens at Star City, or what happens at Houston, or what happens in Europe. How are they like, and how are they different?
Well, I think the main differences are oriented towards the vehicles that are flown by each party. And certainly Russia is very oriented towards the Soyuz and the Russian segment of the space station, and they evolved by training people to fly to the Salyut 7 or Salyut series of stations like Mr. Sharma did, or the Mir station. And so what we see there is a kind of a derivative of that. Our training was heavily based on the shuttle program, the space shuttle program. And then, of course, the European Astronaut Center has sent crew members to both programs, the shuttle and the Soyuz, and so they do basic training there. And specialty training is completed at either Johnson or Star City. The way it's been recently with the International Space Station program, every crew member spends time at all of those centers. because each one of those has assets on the International Space Station that are only trained by them. So the European module, the Japanese module, you have to go to Europe and Japan to train in those. And so the flavor is different for each of those, as you might gather. The language, the culture, the philosophy of training is quite different. And so you come out with a very reality-oriented experience, which serves you well on space station because they really are operated quite differently. The Russians, and I've worked with Russia, by the way, since 1993, actually, so I know them very well. They are very oriented towards hands-on experience and physical exposures to environments to really understand how people behave in those. So you would do sleep deprivation and thermal chambers. They do a lot of parachute training. And by the way, on the way down, as you're parachuting down, you have to work out math problems and figure out where you're going to land and whatnot. So they combine mental and physical stresses together quite effectively, I would have to say. We spend a little bit more time on systems and payloads that you will actually be conducting on station, and spacewalk. We emphasize quite a bit more because most of the spacewalks come from our side of the station. So a little bit of a difference in each place you go. But I would say each of those places, the European Astronaut Center in Cologne or Star City in Russia, Johnson Space Center, Tsukuba Space Center in Japan, all of them have very effective programs because we're quite experienced over the years.
In times to come, if India opts for NASA as its preferred option for training, I know you can't speak for the US government or for NASA, but do you think would Indians be welcome in the astronaut training program?
I can tell you that pretty much any time we've had astronauts from other countries join us because of some decision made well over our levels, yes, we've always embraced them. Absolutely. When they are chosen and they're on the path to fly, then they're one of us.
Now times are coming in America where private companies would be flying astronauts. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about how these companies are doing, and this will be the first time when private ships would be ferrying astronauts.
Well, so we actually are very connected to these efforts. We actually have contracted Boeing and SpaceX to build spacecraft to fly NASA astronauts, and we are very invested in the success of these ships. We know fully well that once we certify these, then they will be able to fly non-NASA people, and we very much support that. We hope that will incentivize new low Earth orbit platforms. And again, more space flight is better for everybody. It means more infrastructure and more redundancy, more capabilities for us to choose from. So it's a very good thing, something we're very supportive of. And in the medical community, we're actually working hard to try to work collaboratively with the commercial companies so that we collect medical data, we share medical data, and we ensure that everybody has access to the same information to optimize the flight experience for everybody.
Is there any apprehension in the astronaut community that these private companies may be cutting corners, may not be doing enough tests, like NASA is known for its rigor before putting anybody into an environment where they are being flown into space?
You know, we would always like to see more tests, whether NASA's building it or a commercial company is building it. You have to understand, we haven't built a new human-carrying spacecraft for 30 years. And all of a sudden, we're building many of them. And it's a very unique time because of that. And these guys are starting from a point of accumulated spaceflight experience that they have access to. And so it's not like the early Apollo days where people really didn't understand the behavior of these vehicles. They're starting at a point with some understanding. And so there's a new balance, which is a little bit uncomfortable, whereby using established information and analysis, you may be able to get by with fewer tests. But nobody knows exactly where that balance is. And that's the discomfort part. You prove the safety, the reliability of a vehicle with repeated use, with field history, flight history. You don't prove it solely on the basis of probability risk analysis. And so that is a bit of an uncomfortable spot for us. We would always like a little bit more testing. But I will tell you that we won't approve the launch of a NASA astronaut unless we're satisfied that.
So does the astronaut have a say in that, or it is kind of he's forced to sit in it and and it goes, or can he say no, I don't trust this new rocket, I don't want to fly?
Well, so the astronauts are very involved in the development of these vehicles. The crew cadre, of which, by the way, Sunita Williams is one, spends a lot of time with the companies that are building these vehicles and has a lot of input into everything from the design of the cockpit to choosing spacesuit material and flight algorithms and whatnot. And so that helps us tremendously. That was the same model during the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo era. And I hope it would be similar with ISRO, that when you select these crew members, especially your test pilot types, they would be intimately involved in the design of the vehicle, because that makes them much more successful operators.
True, but it's easier said than done.
Understand, although we have done it, and Russia has done it, and it has proven to be the right thing to do.
So what would be your message to youngsters in India who aspire to become astronauts?
Well, wow. I would say find something that's useful to spaceflight, whether it's engineering or medicine or a particular type of engineering, mechanical, electrical, aeronautics, and maybe some aspect of that that's very interesting and, again, very important to spaceflight. So battery technology, solar arrays, propulsion, and become very good at it. And you can't really become really good at something unless you really love it. So choose those things and then learn as much as you can about the space program and find out what type of people become astronauts and gravitate towards some of those behaviors if you can. We would like everyone to be astronauts. There's not that many spots right now, but there's going to be more and more in the future as these new vehicles are being built and new platforms are being constructed in low Earth orbit. We expect the opportunities to expand quite a bit. So in the future that will be there, just be prepared as possible for that future with the technical know-how that's useful to us. So.
I'm going to put you on a spot and say, is there any message you have for Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who's a known space buff, the guy who announced that India would undertake human space flight?
Well, first of all, I would say well done. It's an insightful thing to inspire a nation at a time when the capabilities are there and the tool set is understood. The space program is always good for a country. The main thing is ensuring follow-through and making sure that over the time period that's needed for this program to succeed, there is continual support by the people, by the congressional bodies, and by the Prime Minister. And a sustained program that makes good on this promise will pay back India, I think, manyfold.
And a $1.25 billion bill to send astronauts, does that excite you? Because it sounds way cheaper than what Americans, Russians have done.
Oh, sure. It excites me if it works. So yeah, if it works, that will be great. And still seems like a lot of money to me, and it is a lot of money, but it is very low compared to other programs, as you point out. So it's amazing, and make it happen. That's all I can say.
So that was Michael Barrat, an astronaut with NASA who spent 2 sojourns in NASA, speaking to us, telling us the nuances of spaceflight and how astronauts are selected, the kind of changes which happen as humans fly into space. And as he rightly said, the human body is very adaptable to environments where gravity is low, and humans tend to adjust. And he had one message for the leadership in the country: do human spaceflight with an abiding interest. Don't do it as a flash in the pan. In Guwahati, Pallava Bagla.